Missed being here last Sunday, but I had a wonderful time where I was. Y'all probably already know, but I was able to visit with my congregation where I was converted almost 5 decades ago. And they were celebrating their 100th anniversary. And I was very honored that I was one of the ones that they asked to come say a few words in the Bible class hour. So it was a good day. Kind of gave me some thoughts about what we can do here, because we've got a 75th anniversary coming up here in 3 or 4 years. This congregation was planted in 1951, and so 2026 will be our 75th anniversary. And so we'll be thinking about that and making plans for that. But thanks, Brian, for filling in for me, and it's good to have other people that's able to just step up and carry on without missing a beat. Thank you very much for that. I'll call your attention to some things in the bulletin here that continue to ask you to be in prayer about. Greg Dixon is recovering from the surgery that he had this week, and his pain management is improving every day. For that, we're very thankful, and we look forward to him rejoining us here pretty soon. Brandon is still in the hospital. Where did he? There he is. He's still in the hospital this morning, and but he is making some progress.
GI issues, we were really thrilled last night, but this morning he's having a lot of trouble breathing and his lungs don't sound good. So y'all please pray for that.
Well,
I'm more concerned over that than I was with the GI issues and his condition.
absolutely. John, would you word a prayer for us here in just a moment? And particularly, let's remember Brian. We've got others on the list here. Tasha's got father and brother that's there. I've got one I want to add to the list this morning. So Linda Lawler gave me this information. Her daughter-in-law, Tammy McLemore, is scheduled to have a kidney removed here, a cancerous kidney removed later this month in November. And so Tammy McLemore, please add her to your prayer list if you will. Good for us all to be together. Andy, good to have you in here. You're almost a visitor, but Williamson's, good to have you all with us. Good for us to be together. I think Greg Dixon's on our birthday list this week, isn't he? I think he's the only one I see on our calendar that celebrates next Saturday. So there you go. We've got a good crowd this morning, good packed house. So that extra hour, that's what it was. I just now dawned on me there that
Your birthday's next week. Oh, it's next week.
No.
Sarah, I
Next week.
just cover.
Janet.
I'm sorry you're late.
Well, I'm not sorry to see you though. I'm glad to see you very much. Janet has had a little health issue here recently as well, and so I'm glad you're up and about.
I had my caretaker with me.
Well, she must be doing good.
He's hanging in and holding on, that's for sure.
Well, so thankful that you are up and about. I had no idea you'd be with us this morning. So.
Well, we drove here from Bessemer, so I'm thankful we got here sort of in time.
It's a good thing you had that
That's a
extra hour,
pleasant
then, ain't it?
Yeah.
Okay, John's going to lead us in prayer. Do we have anything else that we need to make mention of here before we open our class?
Do you have an update on the next thing?
I do not.
She's a lot better. She has 2 more weeks with the metal neck brace, and she's doing really good.
And Whetstone is
I
doing
took her some-
better. I'm glad of that. Okay. John, if you will.
Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you blessed us with. We thank you for the opportunity that we have to come out on the most important day of the week, and that's the first day of the week, and study thy word, be with our fellow Christians, and praise you in our worship service. Father, we ask you to be with us through that and make sure that we do this in a manner that be well pleasing unto you, and help us know that we're here to praise you. We ask you to keep Glenn in your thoughts this morning as he as he presents our lesson, we thank you for Glenn and his ability. We thank you for the people that can step up when he's not with us, like Brian last week. We're blessed with so many good teachers here at Northport, and we thank you for that. Father, we thank you for the good health that we have. If there are some that we mentioned this morning in our class that need our prayers, and we ask you to be with those that we know, especially those of our class here, Brandon and Greg, who are recovering. We ask you to be with them and be with those that are taking care of them, and bring them back to us as soon as it be thy will. We ask your blessings on Tammy McLemore, who is having surgery within the coming weeks, and be with her and be with her family and help them to support her, and be with those surgeons and the nurses that are taking care of her. We know that her good health will be with her. We ask you to be with our nation, Father, this upcoming week as we have elections in our country. We are so blessed in this country, and we all too often take that for granted. And we ask you to be with us as voters and help us to try to put political figures in place that would bring us more back to you as our Father and as the creator of our earth. We ask you to just be with our country, be with those who are overseas and protecting us and our first responders. We ask you to be with us through this class, Father, and be with Glenn and help us to have a good worship service in an hour or so. We ask all these things in your name's name. Amen.
Thank you, John. Class, I invite you to open the Bibles, if you will, to Matthew chapter 5. Now, you know that we're in a study here that by the time we finish these 12 key chapters, we will have spent the better part of a year on this, but I hope that it's been time well spent for us. We looked at 6 of the key chapters in the Old Testament, and we're now on our second stop. I'll refrain from calling it a chapter because it's actually going to be Matthew 5, 6, and 7. It's the Sermon on the Mount. But this is our second stop in the New Testament. And our overall objective here with all of this is for us to really realize the Bible is about the salvation plan that comes through Christ. And we want to see Christ in every one of these places. And it's easy to do where we are now. But I hope that we've been reminded how that Christ is in the Bible from Genesis 3 all the way forward, actually from Genesis 1:1. It says, God created, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the word God there includes God the Son as part of that as well. So, anyway, where we've been here in the last couple of weeks, our first stop being over in Hebrews, was to think about the law and how the law was being fulfilled and being replaced by the new covenant. And so Moses introduced the law in about 1500 BC. So for 1500 years, the child of God lived and operated under the law of Moses. But Jesus came to replace that, not to destroy it, but to fulfill it and to replace it with the new covenant. You know, we read out in Jeremiah, it says, "Behold, the days are coming when I'll make a new covenant with my people." And so that new covenant is what's being in people. And so that new covenant is what's being introduced here, even images of what Matthew here as we look at the Sermon on the Mount. But Matthew, the book of Matthew in general, is written to what group of people? We've talked about that before. It's really targeted more to the Jews than anybody else. And because of that, we see in Matthew 5:17 here, right off the bat, Jesus makes the comment that I didn't come to destroy the law, but I came to fulfill it. We talked about that before. But here's the thing that I want us to be aware of as we talk about the Sermon on the Mount and the transition to a new covenant. I want us to really be aware of the fact that we're talking about an internal versus external idea. Where the old law was more external, the new covenant that Jesus is introducing is more of an internal. It's not that he's not interested in the external, but it raises the bar, if you will, not just external, but it's now has a lot to do with the spirit. You know, we read over John 4:24, where God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. It takes both. It takes the external, it takes our actions, but it also takes the internal as well. So the last time we were together, we spent some time looking at what's called the Beatitudes in Matthew 5, beginning in verse 3. And again, I emphasize the idea of the internal, the attitude to all of this. So I'm not gonna go back into any of that. In fact, I want to carry our attention down to beginning with verse 21 today. And the Sermon on the Mount, this is really the heart here, beginning in verse 21 and running all the way through chapter 7, maybe down through verse 12. I doubt that we'll get all that done today, but that's really the heart of this Sermon on the Mount, and at the risk of being redundant, it is all about the internal versus the external. So let's look at verse 21 here. This begins a series of Jesus saying, "You have heard, but I say." Look at verse 21 of chapter 5. You've heard. Verse 22 says, "But I say." Go down to verse 27. You've heard. Verse 28. "But I say." Verse 31. "It has been said, but I say to you." Verse 33. Again, you've heard. Verse 34. "But I say." Verse 38. You've heard, but I tell you. And then verse 43, as the chapter comes to a close, "You have heard, but I say." So over and over and over, you're hearing this thing, these statements where you have heard. What's he talking about there when he says you've heard? He's talking about the old law. But he says, "But I say to you." He's raising the standard when he does that. And so we're going to talk about, there's 4 sections here. Most of the rest of the Sermon on the Mount can be divided into 4 sections, these 4 isms. The first one being legalism. We're going to talk about that here shortly. In chapter 6, we begin to talk about something that could be called narcissism or egotism. And then later on in chapter 6, materialism. And then in chapter 7, we talk about criticism, judgment. So let's talk about the idea of legalism here first, because what we've just discussed here about Jesus saying, "You've heard it said, but I say to you," he's really dealing with the legalistic part of the old law, the legalism. So beginning with verse 21, let's read a couple of verses. "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment.' But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of judgment. Whoever says to his brother, 'Raca,' shall be in danger of the council, and whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be in danger of hell fire." So Jesus is not talking about murder here being a problem. The Jews, by and large, weren't, murder wasn't an issue to them, just like it's not to us today. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but that's not the issue that's being addressed here. Jesus is saying it's more than just that. You're angry with your brother. Now he talks about something here that says, that you call him something, or Jesus is not prohibiting these particular, saying you fool. Okay, it's not just that. He's talking about the heart issue here when he's talking about that. So be careful when you're angry with your brother. You ever been angry with your brother?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, ever call someone a fool? See, when my heart's condition is coming out, it's coming out when I say, "You fool, you idiot, you lowlife, you scum, you thug." What am I revealing when I say that? I'm revealing my heart, see. That's the issue that Jesus is addressing right here. Well, okay, so you can see that. If I say something like that, you can see my heart. Maybe you don't see it. Now, I'm sure I'm not describing any of you when I say this. You ever come to church, stick out your hand and shake hands with a brother and say, it's good to see you, all the while having bitterness in your heart toward that person? That's what's being addressed here. Anger in your heart. See, it's not enough. The new covenant that we live under, it's not enough that I say, well, I hadn't murdered anybody. I didn't put my hands on anybody. See, that's the silver rule. I'm not doing something to you. Okay? That's not enough. Jesus is raising the bar here when he says, be careful when you have anger in your heart. Heart issues. That's what's being addressed. So, murder is external, hate is internal. The new covenant governs both. How important is that? How important is the lesson that we're being taught and that's being discussed here? How important is that? Well, read on. Look at verse 23. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. What's being discussed right here is worship. You bring a gift to the altar. You bring your gift. You're worshiping. So how important is it that we have our relationships with our brothers? Okay, how important is it? It precludes worship. We can't worship acceptably if we've got that anger in our heart toward others. Jesus is saying right here, this new covenant that you're about to be under is such that if you've got anger in your heart, don't bring a gift to the altar. I don't want your gift. I don't want your worship until when? Until you get right with your brother. That's how important this is right here. So it says, leave your gift there and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother. I think it's interesting here that Matthew 18 says, if your brother sins against you, what are you to do? Go to him. Then take someone with you. Then take the elders with you. Then finally bring it. Okay, it's laid out, because if your brother sins before you, his soul is in danger. That needs to be cleared up. That's what Matthew 18 is talking about. I think it's interesting and significant that here we read in verse 23, if you bring a gift to the altar there, remember that your brother has something against you. It doesn't say sin. Might not be sin. You're not seeing eye to eye. You got some anger issues in your heart. You got some resentment against your brother. And if that's the case, it precludes worship. You need to go get that fixed with him. Now let me talk about him just a minute. This is not coming book, chapter, and verse, okay? This is GT. If you are the one on the other side that's been offended, that's who I'm talking about for just a minute, okay? If you are that person that's so easily offended, I hope I say this right. Grow up, get over it, develop a little thicker skin. Don't be one that gets offended by every little thing. Now, we're not talking about sin. I mentioned that. Watch Matthew 18. We're talking about just issues. Well, somebody was rude to me. Or somebody didn't speak to me. Or somebody got my chair. Sitting where I usually sit. Okay? If you're in that category, grow up. Mature a little bit. Get over it. But whatever the case may be, this part right here is directed at all of us. We're all to be peacemakers, and we're all to be working with one another. All right, enough said about that. Let's move on. Verse 27. Okay, you've heard that it said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. Adultery, external. All right, but I say to you that whoever looks on a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Lust. Not external, what? Internal. And Jesus is saying, the external is not all you need to be concerned about. The internal. Purity is a matter of, how does verse 28 end? What's the last three words of verse 28? In his heart. Purity is a matter of heart. Look back to 5:8 in those Beatitudes that we talked about earlier. What does it say? Blessed are the pure what? In heart. Purity is a heart issue, see? And so Jesus again is raising the standard here by saying it's not just the physical. It's not, well, you know, nothing physical happened, so I'm okay. Not so. Because Jesus says it's more than just the physical, it's the internal as well.
Well, the thing is if we don't keep our heart right, and if we entertain certain thoughts, you know, you do it long enough and you're going to do something. Because you don't do something until you've thought about it, whether it's momentary or for however long. So if you keep your heart right, that's your best defense against sin. Yeah.
Good, very good comment. And that leads right into what I wanted to say here. And this is not going to be a study about pornography as such. I want to just make a couple of things. Pornography may be the great secret sin of the church. And I'm not talking just to the men here. That's what you think about a lot of times. I'm talking about it to everybody. But let me quote you some statistics here that are about the men. It's just one statistic here, and it comes from the Barna Group and Covenant Eyes. 68% of church-going men. That's 2 out of 3. And over 50% of preachers view porn on a regular basis. Wow. I don't know how true that is. I didn't do that survey, but that's a pretty good group that's conducting that survey that's saying it's a problem among men and women because it's viewed in a way that, well, nobody knows about it. It can be a secret sin. God knows about it, and you know about it, but here's the other thing. I'm not going to follow this any further than this, but pornography can be like a drug in that it can begin innocently enough. Okay? Air quotes. Innocently enough. It's not innocent. But it can begin, and then it's like a drug in that it's more and more and more addictive. It's very serious because it can become a sexual addiction. It can destroy marriages. It boils down to reality versus fantasy. And when reality and fantasy compete, fantasy will always win. And if you let it go on long enough, it can destroy marriages and relationships and whatnot. But here's the problem. See, what's being addressed here is the legalism. The old law said, you shall not commit adultery. Well, I haven't committed adultery. Jesus said, but it's more than that. It's an idea of purity of heart. Because you can have the problem in your heart. It can be lust, and you never act on that lust, but you're still guilty of that as well. So, legalism. All right, let's go on to following that. I'm not going to spend any time here on verse 31 and 32, but this is marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Covered that in Matthew 19, and we'll come back and talk about that at length another time. But we're talking about the legalistic part of the old law. The oaths the same way in verse 33 and 34. The Jews felt like that they could swear by anything as long as they didn't use the name of God. So, as long as they didn't invoke deity in that. They could do oaths as long as it wasn't that. Jesus said, all oaths, just let your word be what it is. Let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. Let's go down to verse 38. Grace. There was no grace under the old law in the sense that you got what you deserve. He says in verse 38, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Incidentally, that comes from Exodus 21:24. That's in the old law. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You knock my tooth out, I'm going to knock yours out. Punch my eye out, I'm going to punch yours out. That was no grace under the old law there. But he said, but I tell you not to resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. Now again, we're talking about the idea of it being the external versus the internal. It's about the heart issue. It's about the spiritual issue. It's about the internal here. Go down to, in this text here, go down to verse 41, because that's interesting there. He says, whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. You remember the back story for that? Remember that? Remember what that's all about? See, the Jews were compelled to help. Incidentally, the word compel here in the Greek means to be pressed into service. So the Jews were compelled to do their part to help with Roman soldiers and their backpacks, their weights that they had to carry. And the law said for a Jew, you had to, when a soldier asked you, you had to carry his burden 1 mile. Now, most Jews, no, I won't say most, I'll say some Jews had that staked off so that they knew from their house exactly how long a mile was and had a stake there. Because when a soldier said, hey, you come here, carry this backpack for me, I got to do it for a mile. At that 1 mile, that's all I got to do. So I drop it at that mile. But what does verse 41 say? See, that anger or that resentment or that bitterness or that heart issue of that Jew was, I'll do what I got to do by law, but that's all I'm going to do. Whoever compels you to go 1 mile, finish it. What does it say? Go with him 2. Well, you might want to put in your margins here. The first mile is the law mile. Second mile is the love mile. If your heart is what it ought to be, then you're gonna do more than what's expected. Always do more than what's expected there. All right, let's go to verse 43. Verse 43 says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." I can do that. I can do that. It's not hard for me to love somebody that loves me. If I'm not careful, it's easy for me to hate somebody that is ugly to me. That was the old law. That was the external. But don't stop there. But I say to you, love your friends and your family. that what it says? What does it say? Love your enemies. Love your enemies. Now that's harder to do. If you got somebody that has just really mistreated you recently, or is on your bad side, or has been rude to you, or has cut you off in traffic, Bill, I have to deal with that sometimes. You know, I just really, that just really gets to me sometimes. That's what we're being told to do here. It says, but I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. That's not so easy to do. Can it be done? Can it be done?
That's the only way you can get through it, usually.
That's
I mean,
it.
the only way, or for me anyway, to, you know, if I have someone that I have something against or that I need to forgive, whether they feel the same way toward me or not, you know, I have to pray every, you know, if it was something big to me or whatever, I can't forgive all of a sudden, but I pray every day to forgive a little more and a little more and a little more. Sometimes it's a process, but yeah, you gotta do it.
If you pray for your enemies, if you pray for those who've wronged you, and if you continue to do that, what happens? I'm not talking about God answering the prayers for you. I'm talking about for you. What happens to you often?
Your heart gets cleansed.
Your heart changes. Your heart softens to that person. I'm talking in general. If you're praying for somebody else and you calling their name in prayer, it has an effect on you as well. But okay, so all of these you have heard, and I say to you, brings us down to verse 45. Because I think that verse 45 really is in the context of every one of these legalistic things that we've talked about here, when it says that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. That's what makes us different. That's what makes us different. The world's not that way. The world is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Remember, we started off this conversation with the parable of the Good Samaritan. What's it called? Oh, come on, Good Samaritan
And well, they have the Levite and the priest.
the Levite.
Yeah.
Thank you. The Levite priest and the Good Samaritan. It just wouldn't come to me. Okay, see, we started off with that. But we got to be different. We got to be different. So here's the deal. Your behavior shouldn't affect my heart. You be rude to me. You be ugly to me. You mistreat me. Should have no bearings on what I do. What should have a bearing on what I do? What we just read. 45 says that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. I got to remember who I am, and I got to remember whose I am. I remember when my sons were at home, and they would leave home, you know, and I would often say to them, remember who you are and remember whose you are. Because that's the difference there. All right, legalism. Jesus said, the new covenant's different. You lived under a legalistic set of laws. I'm raising the bar. I'll be different. Any comments before we leave there and go to chapter 6? Because I want to talk about egotism a little bit.
When doing these things, we're supposed to have Christ in us. So when we do the thing that most men would do, that's showing us. But when we take that next step, it's showing Christ through us.
Excellent, excellent. That makes us different. See, if we do what everybody else has done, then we're just like the world. But we got to be different. We got to carry it to the next level. Christ is in us. We want to be like Christ, so we got to react differently to that. All right, let's move on. We'll get a little bit here said about the egotism. address legalism. Now let's talk about egotism. Chapter 6, verses 1 all the way down to through verse 18 is going to be discussing this idea of egotism. Now, external, internal. You can't really have that discussion without also talking about selfishness and egotism and narcissism. That's all playing into it here, and that's the reason why I've got chapter 6 here listed as the prohibition chapter, because 14 times in this chapter you find do not, do not, do not. So much is being prohibited here, and the thing that's being prohibited is all under the idea of egotism, narcissism, selfishness. And so right off the bat here in verses 1 through 18, as we talk about egotism here, he really does it by looking at 3 areas that we would really consider being part of worship. That's giving, that's praying, and that's fasting. At least as part of our relationship with God. So let's read 1 through 4. Take heed, beware, listen up, pay attention. Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, here's the giving part. When you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. I want to call your attention to something that's found here. It's also found in the prayer issue beginning in verse 5, and also in the fasting issue over in verse 16. The phrase "to be seen." Look at it in verse 1. Don't do your charitable deeds before men to be seen. Go down to verse 5. When you pray, don't pray like the hypocrites, for they love standing in synagogues on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen. Now go over to verse 16. Moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites with sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, that they may appear. It's the same idea. The Greek word here for that they may be seen is actually a theater term. It's actually the term theaomai is the Greek word that we get theater from. And what it means is to be acting, putting on a front, doing something to garner attention for self. Isn't that what narcissistic behavior is? Feeling self, all about me. So anything that we do, we have to be careful. See, we can do the right thing. Is anything wrong with giving? Anything wrong with praying? Anything wrong with fasting? But you can do the right thing for the wrong reason. See, what it says here is they're doing it to be seen of men. Now, also in all 3 of these, you'll see this. Look at verse 4. Your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. Go down to verse 6. Your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. Go down to verse 18. Your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. So if I'm doing something here and my motive is to be seen of men, I want your attention. I want your admiration. The text says if that's your desire, then that's all you're getting out of it. But on the other hand, if you do it with a pure motive, then God who sees in secret will reward you openly. I got to tell you something. I struggle with that. I'm indicted when I read this. You know why? Because when you teach a class and you have people come by you after the class and say, that was so good. And not everybody thinks that. There are a lot of people that think otherwise, they don't come by and say it. That's so good. Or leading public prayers, men, be careful with this. Examine your motives to be sure that we're doing it for the right reason. What is the reason that we're doing it? To bring honor and glory to whom? To God. All glory to Him.
Just back to 5:16.
That's what it said. That's what it said in Matthew 5:16. Let your light so shine before others that they may see your Father in heaven and glorify Him. Thank you so much for being here today. We'll continue our study and finish the Sermon on the Mount next week, I promise.
No, sir. I didn't see me go in this chair.